I see you live.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ben Furman,
And I'm Nate Blyton.
and this is Patch In, the show from SoundNotion.tv dedicated to the wonderful world of electroacoustic music. Let's start with some news.
So, you might remember Keith Kirchhoff and Chris Biggs. They were friends of the show. We had them on a while ago, but their Splice Institute is taking applications right now. Come down to beautiful downtown Kalamazoo and learn about MaxMSP, Super Collider, and Michigan Craft Beer. Guest composer this year is Juwan Park of Large Intestine fame, and beyond Keith and Chris, the faculty includes Per Bloland, Richard Johnson, Elaine Lilios, Elise Roy, Adam Viddix, and Sam Wells. It's awesome, and you should do it. I'm going to try to do it this summer.
Yeah, it sounds like a really great program this year. I probably need to get my application in as well. The applications for that, I believe, are going until February. So you do have a little bit of time in there, but don't put it off until the last minute.
Mm-hmm.
One other news item, and this is a big one, MaxMSP version 7.1 is out. There are a lot of under-the-hood changes and stability improvements, especially to the 64-bit version for Windows. But the big change is that it now has a package manager that makes it easier to find and install external objects and libraries. It makes it really easier to find and install these because they are curated from Cycling 74.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been playing with it since Monday when it came out and am downloading and going nuts with it. It's way too fun and it's way too easy. Also, the snapshot feature that was introduced in Max 7 has been updated to save the state of the entire patcher, not just plugins that you're hosting within your patcher, which makes it much, much easier to use. So if you're a Max user, go and download it.
Mm-hmm.
But today, we are joined by a special guest who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He is currently a professor at UC Santa Barbara and has previously taught at, among others, Harvard, Oberlin, and Les Ateliers UPIC, which is now CC Mix. From 1978 to 2000, he was the editor of the Computer Music Journal and is well known for his books, The Computer Music Tutorial, Microsound, and his latest, Composing Electronic Music, A New Aesthetic. As a composer, he is extremely well known for his work with granular synthesis. So welcome, Curtis Rhodes.
Good to be here.
Well, thank you so much. Your work with granular synthesis is generally considered to be the first application of that technique in digital sound, going back to your piece N-Score. Could you talk a little bit about that and sort of what led you towards granular synthesis in general?
Well, I heard about Xenakis' workshop on formalized music back in 1972, so I drove to Bloomington, Indiana, and participated in that course in May. And over the course of that workshop, we heard about granular synthesis, the theory of stochastic music in general, into which formalized music fits, but we didn't hear any sounds of granular synthesis. So when I went back to, when I decided to go to school to study music composition in the fall of that year, that was certainly on my mind. But I was at Cal Arts at that time, but Cal Arts in 1972 didn't have a computer that was capable of synthesizing sound. So in 1974, I transferred to University of California, San Diego, because they had a large mainframe computer that was capable of synthesizing sound. And the first thing I did was to focus on implementing granular synthesis, and I finally got the first sounds out of the computer in December of 1974.
Mm-hmm. Now, for our listeners, keep in mind that Formalized Music was published in 1971.
Correct.
And having read that, if I'm remembering correctly, most of the examples in the code are in Fortran.
That's right.
So when you're talking about a mainframe computer, you are talking about a serious chunk of space and a language that is not used very often anymore, but that
Right.
at the
Yeah.
time was state of the art, of course.
Well, we programmed on punch cards. Um, you would go to a separate room, and there would be these punch card machines that were not connected to any computer. They were just punch card machines, and you would build up this a big box of these cards, and then submit them to the computer operator. And your job would be computed overnight. And then at the end of the night, or at the next day, you would come and get a large 9-track digital tape. And that was the beginning of a long process of many days and several steps to get a sound out of the computer.
Hmm. And nowadays, we can do this in Max or Super Collider in a matter of minutes, from
Yeah,
conceptualizing to realization.
yeah, yeah. It's a fantastic period
Mhm.
for music creation in general.
Hmm.
I'm getting a note from our producer who is saying that you can also do this on your Apple Watch as well. So,
Exactly.
Right, on my phone, I've got Granular apps,
mhm.
and also on my iPad.
Yeah. So, how have you seen granular synthesis evolve? I mean, obviously the technology has improved to the point that you can do this on a phone, but how have you seen the use of it change
Well,
from?
yeah, yeah, I've written an article about this recently, just kind of surveying the state of granular synthesis, and it still has a ways to go. I mean, I managed to convince Chris Carlson, who wrote Borderlands, which I consider to be the state of the art generator right now that runs on iPad.
Mhm.
But up until recently, his program did not have what I call per grain effects,
Mm.
which has always been key to my implementations of granular synthesis. And that is that every grain is treated at every stage of the signal processing individually. So each grain has its own frequency, each grain has its own envelope, each grain has its own filter, each grain has its own spatial processing. And for me, this is what gives the liveliness and the three-dimensional quality of granular synthesis. I know that in most other implementations, they generate the grain and then they feed them all into the same DSP effects chain. And this has the effect of homogenizing all the grains and making the sound one-dimensional. And I don't find it interesting.
Right. And especially in your works, that does come through, that they're not being processed all en masse and sort of going through that master DSP. Um, but that, of course, increases the computational costs that are associated with granular synthesis as well. So how do you manage that? Is it just a question of taking more time in creating the piece and realizing it in the rendering process, or is it more behind the stage planning in advance?
Oh, well, it's really not an issue. I've been doing this in real time since Super Collider 1.
Mm.
So when someone says, yeah, but it's more processing time, and it's like, yeah, but that was 15 years ago. I can do it, figure it
Yeah, you mention in your new book that we're in the golden age of electronic music right now, and I have to imagine, yeah, just the difference in the tools, uh, like if something that you were able to do 15 years ago with much older technology, well, like it must be a whole different undertaking these days.
Yeah, but I think the real change happened about 20 years ago. Everything kind of switched in around 1990, maybe a little bit before that,
Hmm.
with real time,
Hmm.
real time, high quality digital audio from personal computers, the ability to see waveforms and edit them, which we couldn't do before that. So ever since then, it's just been a speed up of and increasing capabilities. and greater ease, and of course then the explosion of apps, and then the explosion of the whole Eurorack phenomenon.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, where where do you see this going next? You mentioned Eurorack. We've talked about a couple new interesting devices and kind of that revolution, and that's been really interesting, bringing analog back in a new and cheaper way. But
Yeah,
where do you?
we're heavily in. Go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, SB, we're heavily invested in the Eurorack system.
Hmm.
We have 3 Eurorack synths. We have about 60 modules. The main issue with the Eurorack phenomenon in terms of the university is the pedagogical problem,
Okay.
which we don't need to get into in great detail, but I'll just say that each one of these modules, the modules today are much more complicated than the old Moog, ARP, Buchla modules that I used to play with. They're about half of the modules that we have are digital, so they're actually computers. They've reintroduced what we call modal interaction, which means that the great advantage of the old analog synths was that one button, one function, one knob, one function.
Yeah.
Now we have devices, say from Mutable Instruments, the wonderful Braitz oscillator that has 37 different synthesis techniques built into it. So the knob changes for every synthesis, the function of the knobs changes for every synthesis technique. So you have to learn 37 different functions on this one module. And then how do you connect it to another module that also has N functions? So I have a student working on this. His name is Michael Hetrick, and he's introduced an amazing new collection of free modules for Reactor 6 called Eurorack, and these are emulations of modular synthesis units, and he's working on a PhD dissertation on the teaching of modular synthesis.
Wonderful. I'll have to. I'm gonna look that up after the show and see if any of his research is available.
Well, he's written in the past 3 months, he's written about 80 modules.
Oh wow. Okay.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's just explosion. It's free. It's all free.
Okay. Yeah, I know. I've seen a lot of people teaching recently with Reactor and also with the Beep toolkit for MaxMSP, and that has just kind of opened up new vistas in terms of what can be taught at the universities.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely takes things in a different direction. It doesn't solve the fundamental problem of music, which is composition.
Right.
But it is an interesting way to come up with new sounds.
Mm-hmm. Now that leads me down the obvious path of asking about your compositions. Specifically, I've really been listening to the piece Then recently, which unfortunately it's the ICMC version that's on YouTube. I haven't been able to find a newer version, but I was surprised emailing back and forth with you that this is not a granular piece, and yet it sounds so much as if it were a granular piece.
Yes, this is a return to the roots of electronic music. It's all based on analog techniques. I'm using an old school Crohnheit function generator, model 5300A, and an old school Crohnheit bandpass filter, model 3550. And those two, I'm plugging the function generator acting as a impulse generator into the bandpass filter, then passing that into my Studer A807 tape recorder, whose output is then going into a Mackie Onyx 1220 mixer, which has equalization on it. And then I'm feeding the output of the mixer back into the tape recorder and recording everything with my computer. So it's a technique called tape echo feedback. It requires two people to manage all the controls. And so in 2010, I spent a day generating tape echo feedback. It doesn't really need an input once you get the feedback going, but
Okay.
every once in a while we go back and forth between the pulses and the natural tape echo feedback of the tape recorder.
Yeah, and this is an actual two-track reel-to-reel tape recorder as
Correct.
well. So I'm assuming you were also getting in there with a razor blade and Scotch tape as well, or
Well, for this technique, you don't need to do any splicing. I mean, I assembled the piece on my computer.
yeah.
I didn't assemble it on the tape recorder, but I was manipulating on the tape recorder. I bought this tape recorder specifically because it has a varispeed tape. It has continuously variable tape speed, and that's essential to the technique.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like you hear some of the effect of that or the wide range of speed variability in the sound that you hear in the piece of uh, kind of doing these scoops and working in it. It was something that I remembered reading in your new book as well. Kind of you used the word multi-scale composite or conception of composition. Working with something very small and being able to stretch it out or slow it down. And in the book, you talked about as a compositional method, listening to a phrase at half speed or even quarter speed, just to really dial in something specific that you were working on. Did you use that kind of technique in the composition of Then?
Always, always, and I also, when you're in a digital sound editor, when you're zooming into the microsonic level, you're looking at 40 milliseconds on the screen, on a 21-inch screen, it's 40 milliseconds. I'm operating on that level, going down to individual samples if I have to.
Wow. Now, in terms of going back to the original use of the tape recorder and actual impulse generators and filters in the analog domain, and then assembling it digitally, do you feel sort of a different conceptual process when you're working with the analog versus the digital aspects in creating a piece like this?
It's really that again, the controls of that situation, when you have two people
Mhm.
operating these devices, it's a lot of my composition involves setting up some kind of real-time synthesis process and then months and months of editing afterward.
Hmm.
And it was the unique control setup, the control regime of these analog devices that created this unique sound, which I've never heard reproduced by any of the tape emulations. There's a really great tape emulation software that's out now by UHE.
Okay.
What is it name? It's Satin. I call it Satan. Um,
That may be
it's
appropriate.
it's really excellent,
Yeah.
but it's not analog. Some of the most interesting sounds in Then were very low level, weird distortions that happened that I was able to blow up and amplify
Wow.
in my sound editor that you just don't get from Satin or any other tape emulation.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the Berna program for kind of recreating the 1950s electroacoustic music studio experience, but I will definitely have to take a look at Satin as well.
Hmm.
I love Berna, and I
Yeah.
want to do a piece with it.
Okay.
Oh, it's great software. For our listeners, we will put the link to that in the show notes because it's a slightly long one to get into right now, but it's a great program. Um,
And
going.
oh, go ahead, Ben.
Oh no, go ahead.
So well, you mentioned uh, using this pulse generator and the filter, the Croissant 5300 and the 3550. And before the show, you mentioned that we're hearing you through a Sennheiser MD21, which seems like
Correct.
a wonderful old piece of gear, and the quality of your voice on the show uh, is very well captured as a result of it. I'm using an SM58 just because this is what I have around, and it's not quite the same result achieved from it. But I was just wondering, so the analog quality of the gear that you used, and you contrasted it with, or in terms of the tape emulation and doing the tape feedback or the tape echo feedback, that would have not been possible to achieve through digital means. Was it a similar reasoning in the choice of using the very, very analog pulse generator and filter?
Yes. I've never heard a filter that sounds like the Croissant 3550. I mean, the bandwidth of these devices goes out to 200 kilohertz.
Whoa.
Okay.
So it's like between 10 kilohertz and 20 kilohertz. I mean, this filter has such a sweet high-pass filter. I've never heard anything like that digitally.
Excellent. And obviously, like in software, you run into stepping or different kind of digital artifacts working with filters and oscillators. And this obviously bypassed using this kind of gear.
Well, the thing about analog filters is that there's many, many different topologies, whereas in digital filters there tends to be just a few, one or two topologies. They have a similar sound. So with analog, you can, depending on the capacitors and the resistors you put in, changes the sound.
Interesting.
Now with analog, there's always, speaking of capacitors and resistors, the possibility that something might go wrong and glitch in meaningful ways. Did you experience that with any of the gear that you were using?
Well, I mentioned before that there were low-level distortions coming from this process that turned out to be some of the most interesting sounds.
Yeah.
Was not even hearing them when we were generating them. It was only when I played back the sounds and listened to these and amplified, blew up these really low-level sounds, and I heard all this kind of weird stuff going on.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so with this piece then, so you said that you used a kind of improvisational technique with this equipment, recorded it, put it in, and then moved over into Pro Tools and worked with it for months. And that resulted in the 2014 version of the piece. But then you've gone back and reworked the much of it, I understand. What was that process like?
Right. Well, I was not satisfied with the last 10 minutes of the piece. I've been spending the past year working on it. I was working on it last night. I was working on it the night before.
Wow.
So it's been about 5 years since the original day that I made the tape echo feedback. That's kind of tends to be typical of my process.
Mm-hmm.
I work very much in detail and on all time scales, and it takes me a long time to arrive at the result that I'm really happy with. But what I was able to do with then was the last 10 minutes of the piece needed more material, so I was able to add a bass line and some tones that I generated with FM8.
Okay.
And also, I generated some Pulsar material from our Pulsar generator program running on Super Collider.
Cool.
Now,
And-
on this,
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, on the subject of Pulsar generators, that is another thing that you are very well known for. Could you talk a little bit about Pulsar generation and your work with that in Super Collider?
Yeah, Pulsar synthesis is a method where you generate a waveform followed by a silent period or dead time, and the total duration of that is called the pulsar, the waveform, and the dead time. And by varying the dead time, you can change the formant above the fundamental frequency of the pulsar.
Mm-hmm.
So you have independent control of the waveform, the envelope, the frequency, and the formant. And so with Pulsar Generator, we line up 3 of these to the same fundamental frequency, but we have 3 independent formants. And all of these formants can vary in space. So this was a completely new sound, a sound that had 3 independent formants that could vary completely independently and independently in space. And it emulates, the initial impetus was to emulate exactly the sound of an impulse generator going into a bandpass filter.
Mm-hmm.
But it turned out to be, we gave it envelope control over all parameters, which is really essential to that technique. The fact that you can design envelopes for each one of these formants, each one, the fundamental frequency, and the time scale of the synthesis can happen, well, you can run it continuously or you can plan it to last a certain duration. So that was a really wonderful program. It was written in Super Collider 2. Mm-hmm. And then about 9 months later, Apple came out with OS 10 and made that program obsolete. So I still run it on my Apple G4, but that's pulsar synthesis.
Yeah. And then, in addition to that, I first read about pulsar synthesis in your article from, I believe it was 2010, where you're also talking about matching pursuit decomposition.
Right. Yeah, matching pursuit decomposition is the analytical counterpart of granular synthesis. So it will take in a sound and analyze it and break it down into constituent grains. That's a very computationally intensive process, but once that is done, you essentially have a list in text of all the different grains that go into the signal, and it's very easy to create an editor to manipulate the granular representation to create transformations of that sound.
Mm-hmm. Which you did invest quite a bit of time into researching this as well, and it's an absolutely phenomenal paper that we'll have to include the links to that as well in the show notes. It was absolutely mind-blowing to read, but unfortunately has not really gone any further with the research.
Yeah, that's been a real disappointment for me. We had a National Science Foundation grant, and that funded, I was able to pay a couple of graduate students to work on this project and develop a sound editor called Scatter. We made a beautiful demo video.
Yeah.
We published 7 papers, and we applied for an extension of the grant, and it was not approved. So it kind of died at that point.
Yeah. Tragic.
Do you think there's any way that project could be rebooted in the future, or is...
Make me an offer I can't refuse.
Believe me, if I could.
Yeah.
Now, what would the implications have been in terms of composition if you had been able to get that grant and further refine the application?
Well, the ability to manipulate sound on the granular level, to take in any sound and analyze it, we already, if you go to the demo video is still up, and I can send you the link to that.
Yeah.
I think it would have had great implications. It's another means of time stretching, of filtering, of pitch shifting. All based on this granular representation, so you can tell it to, for example, pick the shortest grains and do something very specific with them. Pick the longest grains, do something with them. So you can specify which grains you'd like to operate. We had a lasso tool, so you could encircle a group of grains and then perform a manipulation just on those grains. So it's the ability to go into the microsound level and manipulate sounds from at that micro level that was the power of this technique.
Wild. Well, I'll have to, at the very least, look for some of those papers that to get to learn a little bit more about the subject. I've been enjoying going through some of your other recent writing, notably this book that you released this year, Composing Electronic Music: A New Aesthetic. And it's a really interesting undertaking. I can't wait to dig into it more. In it, you mention some of your older writing, the computer music tutorial from 1996, I believe, and that was kind of the technical manual, and where this was talking about composition and the nature of sound, and you dig into multi-scale organization as well as pitch and rhythm, and then the last and final chapter is the art of mixing. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your strategy in constructing this book. I know this is a huge project that has been many, many years in the making.
Well, my first book on composition came out actually in 1985.
Okay.
It's called Composers in the Computer. It's published by AR Editions. It's probably out of print at this point. But it was a collection of interviews with composers because I wanted to advance the discourse about composition. My general feeling has been that when I was a student, the level of discourse about composition was not really very high. Many composers really couldn't talk about their music very other than to say, well, you know, I like that, or this is the pitch row that I used. And I always got a sense from, well, I lived in France for 6 years, and in the European cultural scene in general, it's very important for a composer to have a position, a point of view, and to be able to defend that point of view, and basically to have an aesthetic. And I always encourage my students to think about what they are for in music, what they are against in music, what they stand for. And basically this book, Composing Electronic Music: A New Aesthetic, is what I stand for. It's a look into my position on various topics, from sound transformation, rhythm, pitch, space, multi-scale organization, narrative, generative strategies, and the art of mixing. So it's my point of view, but it's definitely meant to be something to challenge readers to develop their own point of view, to see if they agree with me or don't agree with me on these same points. Mm-hmm. But at least to have a point of view.
That's, yeah.
So do you see people responding to the book already and coming up with their own points of view that they're now expressing?
Well, I was an editor of Computer Music Journal for about 23 years. And, I would often entice authors to submit articles because of the prospect of their fame and glory that they would receive from publishing an article, knowing full well that they'd get very little response. And the same is true of a book. It takes about a year, maybe a year and a half, to get a real response from a book. So the book came out in June, late June, and there isn't really much of a response yet. I'm getting individual people emailing me, but I think we'll begin to see a response to it in a year or so. Now, my previous book, Microsound, which has sold around 8,000 copies, which is astounding. I mean, a big surprise to me.
I have one on my desk right now, actually.
Yeah, thank you. But that book was never even reviewed in The Wire, which I just thought amazing. So it's, you think you're going to get a reaction to these things, but you don't. However, someone at Ferrari read Microsound, and that led to a consulting situation where we analyzed the sound of Ferrari race cars using the matching pursuit technique. So
Really?
these books do lead to things, but you never know what they're going to lead to.
So you analyzed the sound of Ferrari engines. Tell me about that project. What went into that? Was it just kind of going
Right.
through and figuring out what makes the Ferrari sound?
Well, yeah, one day I opened up my mail and there was a letter from, oh, here's my cat.
Wonderful.
That is not a Ferrari engine.
Let me see. Should we take a break while I feed her?
If you'd like, that's
Sure.
fine. Sure.
Yeah, let's take a little break. Just a second.
Okay,
Yep.
thanks.
Otherwise, she'll just.
A lovely backdrop.
All right, so we're taking a break at 36:40 on the recording.
Yeah.
I dropped a marker.
Sweet.
Since I've been in the habit of editing these, I might go so far as to take out a couple of the pauses and things like that.
Yeah.
Please do.
Yeah.
Oh, I always forget how heavy these headphones are until we're doing a podcast.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Ferrari story.
Mhm.
Yeah, one day I received a letter from the head of the acoustic research laboratory at Ferrari in Maranello, Italy, asking me to come over and talk to them about working on analyzing the sound of Ferrari engines. And he said that he had read my book, Microsound, and that was how he found out about me. So I flew over to Italy and went into their top secret factory and spent a day watching how Ferraris get built. They're built, each one is built by a single person, the entire car. And it turns out that for those of you who don't know, one of the main selling points, if not the selling point of Ferraris, is their sound. So that to this day, if I drive to Los Angeles and I hear a car behind me, I can tell if it's a Ferrari or not. It has a very distinct acoustic signature. It's designed that way. There's many things that go into that. But they were having trouble distinguishing gearbox rattle from the engine noise. And the matching pursuit technique is particularly good at analyzing noises. So we were able to take recordings of Ferrari cars and separate out those two factors, because Ferraris are built just like a Boeing 747. They're modeled in a computer way before they're ever put into material form. And that includes the sound. They build a complete physical model of the car before they put it into production. So we were able to do that for them.
Very interesting. Were you able to use any of the data or any sound recordings of Ferraris for a piece as well?
You know, I was tempted to do that, and then I thought, I don't think so. It's just like, no, don't
I mean,
go there.
I don't know that I could resist that temptation, given
Yeah.
close access to one.
It would kind of be dangerous territory, I imagine, especially in surround works of zipping around.
But you know, my piece then,
Mhm.
a lot of it to me sounds like driving. It's a journey. It's a journey. Speed up and slow down. Speed up, slow down. Go around a curve. It's very much a journey metaphor.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, do you see that in any of your other pieces as well?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
It's a journey, taking you on a ride. And look at that. Look at this. Well, it's off to the left. Look at that. Off to the right. Now we're going faster. Now we're slowing down.
Mhm.
Let's stop.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was really
it's a metaphor of a journey.
Yeah, I was really kind of struck by the similarities of some of your pieces. In particular, Point Line Cloud, 11th Vector, and Half-Life together, and
11th
how,
Vortex.
yes, 11th Vortex, not Cloud. My mistake. Um, yeah, how everything sounded very organic and different from each other, but still that there was this sense of interrelationship between those works.
Yes, I agree. Point Line Cloud is all produced with the same materials and techniques. So, but I've got some new stuff coming out that's made with completely different materials, and
Oh, cool.
including then.
Hmm. What other kind of things are you working on, if
Yeah.
you don't mind sharing? Or...
No, I'd love to talk about them. I've got a piece called Modulude, which is all based on modulation. Um, frequency modulation was the technique of the 1980s, and just about every piece of computer music in that period was made with that technique. And we all became sick of it after a certain period. It kind of fell out of favor. And so what I'm saying is FM is back.
Okay.
I'm bringing it back.
I'm sure John Chowning is more than happy to hear that.
Yes, he's going to be here on in about a month. We're doing a concert of spatial music in the Allosphere, which is our
Oh, cool.
54.1 sound sphere.
Wow.
Yeah, it's going to be amazing. And he's going to do his piece Stria.
Oh, nice. I've only had the opportunity to hear that in up to 4.1 sound. So,
Yeah, I've never been able to experience something like a 54.1 setup in a room. How is it different? What are the benefits of a space like that?
Well, this is, last month I was in Karlsruhe, Germany at the ZKM,
mhm.
the Zentrum für Kunst und Medientechnologie, where they have the Klang Dome, which is a 47.1 dome of Meyer sound speakers over the head of the audience. And what it makes possible is just an extraordinary listening experience. I used a version of the zirconium program, which was written by my student Shekhar Ramakrishnan. We put a super collider interface on it to implement my theory of what I call spatial chords, which is a method of real-time spatialization, real-time upmixing. Because the problem with, when you have 8 channels, you can still control it all with your hands, and I love to do that. But
Yeah.
when you get up to 47, 54, 100, 1,000, you're going to need some assistance. You're going to need some kind of a strategy for generative upmixing. So I've got this theory called spatial chords. We're working on a paper on it, but I was able to spatialize this piece in real time over the 47 speakers of the Klang Dome. We're going to do the same thing in the Allosphere. And the idea is that you set up a situation where you tell the interface how many sources you'd like to have and how closely spaced you'd like to have them to be. You don't tell them exactly where they're going to be. You just say the number and the spacing. So it generates the sources. Let's say you say 4 sources, and these create a kind of rhomboid shape, let's say, and then you say rotate that shape over time at this speed. And then you set up another situation. You say, now I'd like it to have all 47 speakers. So it creates these geometric forms that then can be rotated and tilted in real time. And you just set these up and then press the button, and it slowly or quickly or slowly fades to the new position, the new geometric form, or spatial chord, as I call it.
Wow.
I'm really kind of struck by the that idea and its relation to a lot of what I see people doing with projectors, especially in settings like planetariums where they're working with multiple projectors on a dome and doing essentially the same thing.
Well, the Allosphere, which is directed by my colleague, Professor Joanne Kuchera-Morin, it's her design, has 27 stereo projectors and a 54.1 sound system. So it's a completely immersive environment in a 3-story sphere. You're out in the middle. There's a walkway in the middle of the sphere that you walk onto, and the 3D quality of the images and the sound is quite extraordinary.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, it's been great to hear about your projects, and can't wait to read more of your writings about this spatialization and hear the new pieces coming up. Do you have any other things that you'd like to plug here as we come to the end of the show? Other events coming up as we approach the holidays, I suppose?
Well, right now I'm putting the finishing touches on a record that's going to be produced by Carl Records, Karl, in Berlin, and it's going to come out on vinyl. So this will be then my piece Half-Life, my piece 11th Vortex, and Purity all are going to be on an LP version. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Wow. That makes me want to actually get a new needle for my turntable.
Me too.
I mean, I've been putting it off for a while now, but I really should
Give it up.
do that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a real pleasure to be able to talk with you for a little bit and hear about all of these exciting developments and also kind of the history behind some of the pieces and your compositional process.
Thank you. It's been a privilege.
Thanks.
All right. Well, and this has been another episode of Patch In from SoundNotion.tv. You can, of course, subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or via your favorite podcasting software. And we will have show notes up on our website, soundnotion.tv/pi. Also, if you want, you can donate to the podcast through our website or through our Amazon affiliate program. You're already buying stuff on Amazon anyway, so why not search and give us a very small amount of money through your purchase. Not that you're actually giving us anything or paying more, but Amazon throws money back to us. So, once again, thank you to Curtis Rhodes. And I am Ben Furman.
I'm Nate Blyton.
And this has been Patch In.
Cool. And